She has 3.5 seconds left to live. Heidi Furris is on the phone with 911, telling an operator someone is trying to break into her home. Her voice is calm, frightened but functional. She gives her address, she stays on the line, and then silence. No door splintering, no footsteps, no struggle, no scream. Just 3.5 seconds of complete silence, and then a shotgun blast, and then nothing. The man who called back moments later, the man who said he'd been fighting an intruder for control of the weapon, was her husband, Nick. He would tell police the whole thing happened so fast. A stranger, he said, a big man in a dark hoodie who forced the door, grabbed the barrel, and accidentally caused a tragedy in under 4 seconds. But here is the thing about that 911 tape. In a real forced entry, you hear the door, you hear the chaos, you hear something. And investigators were about to find out why you hear absolutely nothing on this one. St. Paul, Minnesota, in the spring of 2011, was still shaking off the last bruises of the recession. Whole neighborhoods of neat brick bungalows sat in quiet stages of financial distress. Foreclosure notices tucked behind mailboxes, moving trucks working the same streets in alternating directions. On Minnehaha Avenue West, a young married couple had been living that contradiction quietly for 2.5 years. To the outside world, they looked fine, more than fine. Heidi Furris was 32 years old, and the people who knew her described her the way people describe someone who makes a room warmer just by walking into it. She worked hard. She had a new friend at work named Jolene, and the Saturday before she died, she was excited enough about their shopping trip to the Mall of America that she was probably already thinking about it when she woke up. Small budget, maybe $30 or $40, but she had cash from tips her husband had brought home, and she was going to spend time with someone she was just starting to like. That morning, Nick brought back breakfast from the Grand Beer Grill. Breakfast in bed on a Saturday. They were the kind of couple who did that. Jolene came at 1:30 in the afternoon to pick Heidi up. Nick says he came home from REI specifically to meet her, curious about this new friend his wife had been talking about. Heidi and Jolene headed to the mall. Nick stayed home, read for a while, took a nap, played on his computer. When Heidi got back around 6:30, they ordered dinner from Green Mill. Burgers, delivered. They opened a bottle of Rex Goliath Red, their go-to cheap Cabernet, and then they watched Avatar on DVD for the first time, which Nick said he'd bought because it was supposed to be the best movie in the world, and neither of them had seen it. The film ran long. They were in bed by midnight. Heidi played Bejeweled on her iPhone while Nick stayed up to catch the end of the Stanley Cup playoffs. San Jose over Colorado 5-2 once the empty net goals were counted. Around 12:15, Nick went to sleep. Heidi, he said, was the kind of sleeper who sometimes walked, sometimes talked, always woke around 3 a.m. for the bathroom. It is a portrait so complete, it feels almost performed. But we will come back to that. Here's what Heidi did not know when she went to bed that night. By Monday morning, less than 36 hours away, she and Nick were legally required to vacate that house. The bank had completed foreclosure proceedings. The locks would be changed. Their life on Minnehaha Avenue was already over. They had thousands in credit card debt. Their combined income was $71,000 a year against a mortgage, a second lien, and a debt assistance program they were failing to keep up with. Nick had been hiding the severity of it for months, possibly longer. And not one friend, not one family member, not one person outside of their marriage knew any of it. Heidi went spring shopping the afternoon before she was supposed to be evicted from her home. She did not know. When Nick sat down with a detective from the St. Paul Police Department in the hours after Heidi was shot, the interrogation began the way they often do, gently, with an invitation to go back 24 hours and just talk. Nick talked, at length, with precision. Breakfast, REI, Jolene's arrival at 1:30, the specific Green Mill location, Rex Goliath Cabernet, Avatar on DVD, the Stanley Cup score,
Then the correction, not 3-2, actually 5-2, because San Jose scored a couple of empty net goals. Heidi on her iPhone playing Bejeweled. Approximate bedtime, 12:15. The detective sat and listened. There is something researchers who study interrogations have noted repeatedly. Innocent people, in the hours after trauma, tend to produce fragmented accounts. Memory under acute grief comes out jagged, punctuated by "I can't even remember" and "it's all a blur," and long pauses that have nothing to do with evasion. The brain is simply not functioning like a recording device. It is trying to survive. Nick's account did not sound like that. He was not fragmented. He was not blurring. He was building something, a tableau of an ordinary Saturday evening so carefully assembled that the detective, even in those early minutes, was already paying attention to the temperature of it. Then Nick described what woke him around 6 a.m. He said he heard the screen door open. Then he heard someone working the front doorknob, shaking it, shoving it. He got up, went to the bedroom closet, and retrieved his shotgun, a Bi-Cow side-by-side 20-gauge he'd bought from his best friend Jordan Kimball for $150 3 years earlier, originally for grouse hunting up at the Boundary Waters. He said the gun was stored unloaded, but he kept 2 shells on top of the cabinet, just in case things went weird, his words. He loaded it. He woke Heidi. He told her to grab her shoes and call 911 because they were going to the garage. The bedroom was upstairs. There was one staircase. The alleged intruder was at the front door. The detective asked the obvious question, why go downstairs at all? Why move your wife toward the threat instead of barricading the bedroom, pointing the shotgun at the only door, and waiting for police to arrive? Nick had an answer ready. He said that about 1.5 years earlier, police had once hammered on their door late at night while serving a warrant for someone else. He and Heidi had talked after that, a real conversation, he said, and they had come up with a plan. If it ever happened again, they would get to the garage, get in the car, and leave. Just get out. He said Heidi had actually been frustrated with him during the police incident for not acting fast enough. This, he said, was the plan they had worked out together. He was not panicking, he explained. He was executing their plan. But here is the problem. The detective had just told him that blood had been found in the basement. Not trace evidence, blood. And the pellet patterns on the door were not consistent with a shot fired from the position Nick had described. The ground was already shifting under the intruder theory, and Nick, confronted with physical evidence that contradicted him, did not grow uncertain. He did not say, maybe I'm misremembering the angle. He said, no, everything happened exactly as I described, right there in the foyer, nothing else. That is not how traumatized memory works. That is how a fixed story works. Investigators began pulling the scene apart from the moment they arrived. The front entryway showed no damage consistent with a forced entry. The deadbolt lock had not been defeated. The door frame was intact. There were no marks, no splintering, nothing to suggest the door had been forced open by a large man in a hurry. No DNA was recovered from the door or the foyer. No fingerprints belonging to an unknown person were identified anywhere in the entry area. No neighbor on Minnehaha Avenue West reported seeing anyone leave the house that morning. No vehicle matching any description was observed in the area. No surveillance footage anywhere near the address captured an unfamiliar figure. The neighborhood had eyes, it always does, and every set of eyes came back empty. On the 911 tape, the most important piece of evidence in the case, Heidi's voice is calm but frightened. She tells the operator someone is trying to break in. She gives her address in fragments. She stays on the line. And then silence. No door, no impact, no male voice, no commotion, no sound at all that corresponds to a man forcing entry, grabbing a shotgun barrel, and struggling for control of a loaded weapon within arm's reach of an active phone call. 3.5 seconds of silence, then a single shotgun blast, then Heidi's voice once more, briefly, then nothing. The medical examiner's findings placed the entry wound in Heidi's back, upper toward the shoulder blades. She had been moving away from the shooter when she was hit. That part of Nick's story was consistent, but the trajectory of the pellets, the angle of entry, and the blast pattern were not consistent with an accidental discharge during a close-quarters struggle near the front door. They were consistent with a shot fired deliberately from a controlled position at a person already in motion away from the gun. The blood in the basement had no explanation Nick could offer. He suggested it might have seeped through the kitchen floor. Investigators noted that seepage does not behave the way that blood had behaved. Nick told the detective he had no life insurance policy on Heidi. That part was true. There was no policy in place. But there had been a meeting. About 3 weeks before Heidi died, Nick had sat down with an insurance agent named Peter, Northwestern Mutual, he thought, and they had been trying to schedule a follow-up appointment. The schedules kept not lining up, Nick said. They just hadn't made it work. 3 weeks before her death, a life insurance consultation that never converted into a policy. And then there was the foreclosure, the house they had to vacate by Monday, the secret Nick had kept from everyone, including, by all available evidence, Heidi herself. He told investigators she was planning to go spring shopping on Saturday. He said she had been looking forward to it. He said the night before she died, they had sat down together after the Green Mill delivery and worked on their budget for an hour, talking about paying down debt, building savings, planning the next chapter. He described a woman who believed she had a future to plan for. And the detective, at some point during that long morning, pulled on a thread that had been dangling since the first hour of the interview. If the marriage was that strong, the finances that shared, the plan that mutual, why did Heidi not know they were being evicted the next day? Nick said they were both ashamed, both too proud to ask for help. Both, but only one of them had been living inside the numbers. The investigation that followed Heidi's death stretched for nearly a decade. Nick was not immediately arrested. The case was built slowly, the way cases built on circumstantial and forensic evidence often have to be built, layer by layer, until the structure is strong enough to stand on its own. During that time, Nick remarried. He had children. He moved through a version of ordinary life. The Ramsey County investigation continued in the background. What investigators accumulated over those years was not a single smoking detail. It was an architecture of incompatibility, the sum of 100 small things that did not fit the story Nick had told that morning. The 911 tape, the intact door frame, the absent intruder, the blood in the basement, the pellet angles in the door, the trajectory of the wound, the life insurance consultation that had not yet converted, the foreclosure Heidi appeared not to know about, the timing of a death that came precisely one night before a woman was going to wake up and discover everything her husband had been hiding. Detectives also took a close look at the shotgun itself. Nick had described the weapon in extraordinary detail during the interrogation. The gauge, the manufacturer, the purchase price, the reason it had been moved from the basement to the bedroom closet, the precise location of the 2 shells on top of the cabinet. That level of detail offered spontaneously was not the behavior of a man narrating chaos. It was the behavior of a man explaining a prop. A man whose wife did not want that gun in the bedroom. A man who told investigators he had moved it upstairs about a month earlier, not long by coincidence, after a life insurance consultation that had not yet converted. In the interrogation, when the detective pressed Nick on the inconsistency of going downstairs toward the threat rather than staying in the bedroom, Nick said something that the detective would later describe as one of the most revealing moments of the entire interview. Nick said, "The compassionate part of me is not pulling the trigger." too compassionate to defend a staircase from an intruder, not too compassionate to walk his wife directly into the line of fire. In May 2021, 10 years after Heidi died on the kitchen floor of a house she did not know was already gone, Nick Furris was arrested and charged with second-degree intentional murder. A Ramsey County grand jury later returned a broader indictment, first-degree premeditated murder.
At trial, prosecutors presented an argument about motive that was more precise than simply money. It was not just that Nick was hiding a financial collapse, it was the specific shape of what Monday morning was going to look like. Heidi would have woken up to boxes, to a trailer, to a conversation they had never had, to the realization that their savings were gone, their house was gone, and the man she trusted had been managing or mismanaging their entire financial life in secret for well over a year. She would have found out who she had really been married to. The prosecution argued that Nick killed Heidi not to collect money he did not yet have, but to prevent a mourning that was 24 hours away, a mourning that would have ended the marriage on Heidi's terms, not his. The intruder story was designed to explain the wound in her back, a woman shot while running away. It was designed to explain why Nick was in possession of the weapon. It was designed to explain the 911 call Heidi had already made. Every element of the fabrication was built around the one physical fact Nick could not escape. His wife was shot from behind in her own home by a gun that belonged to him. The defense argued that the physical evidence was ambiguous, that the investigation had been inadequately pursued in the crucial early hours, and that the absence of a confession meant the absence of certainty. The jury deliberated. Then they came back. Guilty. First-degree premeditated murder. On April 13, 2023, Nicholas Furris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release. On February 25, 2026, the Minnesota Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and sentence. The court found the evidence sufficient. Every appeal closed, every door shut. Heidi was 32 years old. She had been to the Mall of America the afternoon before she died. She had a new friend she was just starting to know. She had plans, modest ones, ordinary ones, the kind that require a Tuesday morning to execute. She never got the Tuesday morning. The psychological portrait that emerged across a decade of investigation described a man who had built an identity around appearing capable, stable, and in control. The organized man, the reasonable husband, the careful gun owner, the compassionate person who does not pull the trigger. When that identity became incompatible with reality, the solution he chose was not confession or confrontation, it was construction, a story built in advance, assembled in real time during a 4-hour interrogation, and maintained without material revision for 10 years. That is the part that stays with you. Not the crime itself, as horrifying as it was, but the 10 years of ordinary life that followed it. The remarriage, the children, the version of normal that continued while Heidi's family waited. The case of Heidi Furris is not just a story about one man's lie. It is a story about the specific vulnerability of people who trust completely. Heidi trusted Nick with the finances. She trusted him with the truth about where they stood. She trusted the plan, his plan, which she believed was their plan. She trusted that when he told her to grab her shoes and head for the garage, he was trying to save her. She was still on the phone with 911 when she died. She was doing everything right. What failed her was not naivety. What failed her was the assumption that the person who knows everything about your life is also the person who would never use that knowledge against you. That is not a character flaw. That is love operating the way love is supposed to operate, with full exposure. The broader failure here belongs to a cultural pattern that investigators encounter repeatedly in intimate partner homicides, the long runway between warning signs and action.
the financial concealment, the isolation of a spouse from information that affects her life, the escalating pressure of a hidden crisis. These are not invisible. They are visible to someone with the right frame. Heidi did not have that frame because she was not given the information that would have built it. There are resources now, financial transparency advocates, domestic abuse organizations that specifically address coercive financial control that did not exist in the same form in 2011. Recognizing that economic isolation is a form of control, not just a personal struggle, is the systemic lesson this case demands. Heidi Furris deserved a Tuesday morning. She deserved to know the truth about her own life. She deserved the chance to be angry, to grieve, to rebuild, to decide. She was denied every single one of those things in 3.5 seconds of silence.
The Minnesota Supreme Court's unanimous affirmation in February 2026 closed the last legal door for Nick Furris. He will die in prison. But one question from this case does not close with a gavel. The detective who conducted that 4-hour interrogation on the morning of the shooting identified the inconsistencies in Nick's account in real time. He pressed on the garage route. He challenged the pellet angles. He named the blood in the basement directly. He asked Nick point blank if he had anything to do with his wife's death. Nick said absolutely not. And then the case went quiet for 10 years. So here's what I want you to weigh in on, because I genuinely want to know what you think. Was the decade-long gap between that interrogation and Nick's arrest a failure of investigative resources and forensic technology that simply wasn't available yet? Or do you believe investigators had enough in those first hours to charge him and chose not to? That distinction matters, because if it was resources, the system failed Heidi through limitation. If it was choice, the system failed her through something else entirely. Tell me which one you believe, and tell me why.